reincarnation can exist. Therefore, any evidence for it must be trumped up or false to begin with. And, that's a very unscientific way to look at the world, because a real scientist should say, hey, I'm open to look at any phenomenon and to examine it, without prejudging it. I know we have lots of theories about how the world works, but ultimately, the world will show us how it works.
Welcome to the Consciousness of the Way. I am your humble servant and seafood, Taoist Master San Qing, and I want to welcome to the podcast today a journalist who is a world-renowned author in Old Souls. Oh my goodness,
blank. I'll help you out there. It's scientific evidence for reincarnation from children who recall past lives.
Right. Scientific evidence for reincarnation on children who recall past lives, and I'll edit that. So I want to thank you for Tom Shroder for coming on the podcast today. And I want to get you to just share a little bit about yourself for the audience, leading you up to this point.
Yeah, well, I've been a journalist my whole career. I started off as the editor of the college paper at the University of Florida. And then I worked at newspapers in Fort Myers, Florida, Tallahassee, Florida, Cincinnati, Ohio, Miami, Florida, and then at the Washington Post. And I live in the Washington area now. And basically, my first reporting job it's hard for me to even say this, was 50 years ago. And then in 1990, in the late 1990s, I got fascinated by a psychiatrist, a very prominent and well-respected psychiatrist at the Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami Beach. And he wrote a best-selling book about patients that he'd had who, when he regressed them under hypnosis, they seemed to recall previous lives. So I like journalists are always looking for things that are unusual or that turn the expected around. And the fact that this establishment psychiatrist was making a mint on the circuit, on the sort of New Age circuit, with these stories of people who recall previous lives, I found that interesting. And his name was Brian Weiss, and the book was a very well-known book. Many of your viewers might know, called Many Lives, Many Masters. And he was a great guy. Really enjoyed talking to him. But I didn't think that his cases were very good evidence for reincarnation because, and I underwent hypnosis myself. And the whole process of hypnosis is the hypnotist is inviting you to explore your imagination. It's asking you to fantasize, basically. And, I came up with a past life, but it didn't feel like anything that was particularly real to me. It was sort of like the same muscle that I would use if I was writing a short story. Mm-hmm. And you know how when sometimes fiction writers will tell you their characters start talking to them as if they had, a life of their own. Well, it has that kind of a feeling where, the story you're in your mind starts developing almost of its own volition. So I could see where people would think, oh, that might have been a real past life. However, none of the cases had people remembering things about specific lives that they couldn't have known or made up just from reading historical fiction or just using their imagination. None of them, suddenly spoke fluent ancient Mandarin or something like that. And some of them in his book, he had people like, for instance, he had one person saying, who was supposedly back in the 18th century or something, saying they couldn't say the date because they couldn't find a newspaper. And then at the same time, that same person later gave an exact date just off the top of her head, So there were contradictory things as well. But when I was researching the story, I came across another psychiatrist, a guy named Ian Stevenson, who had been at the University of Virginia. At one time, he'd been the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. And he wasn't any longer because he had gotten completely involved with his search for, he came into contact with a bunch of reports about reincarnation. And they were all in different forms and everything. But there was one thing that caught his eye, was that they all seemed to originate with very small children who began to spontaneously speak about previous lives that they'd had. And so he was fascinated by this, in large part because, small children have a very limited access to information. So if a small child comes up with specific details about a dead stranger's life, it's very hard to imagine how they could have gotten that information in any normal way. And I'm talking about children who, with their first words, began to say things like, "You're not my real mom. You're not my real dad. This isn't, I live in a different kind of house than this." And so he got interested enough about this that he spent 30 years, by the time I hooked up with him, traveling the world, finding case reports, and then going and personally investigating the case reports, using the tools really of an investigative journalist, conducting interviews, checking records, looking for recorded records of the child's statements that could later be checked against the reality. So I thought that it took me 2 years to persuade him to let me come with him on his field trips. I mean, he was already like 80 years old, and he basically said he was retired. But I had a sense that he really wasn't retired. And he also didn't want any sensationalization of what he was doing, because his only goal was to get serious scientists, his peers and colleagues, to take this seriously. And he thought that, that a journalist would sensationalize it and not sort of do it with the sober sort of intent that he brought to this. But I persuaded him that, and also I said, look, you've been doing this for 30 years and almost nobody knows about this work. So what do you have to lose? So I went with him on his field trips. We spent a month in Lebanon, in the Druze community, where there are many cases of children who speak about previous lives. In fact, the Druze word for somebody who's reincarnated is those who speak about previous lives. It's not those who have lived before. It's those who speak about previous lives, which is an indication that this phenomenon has been ongoing in their community for generations, for it to actually be the word for reincarnation. And then we also spent a month in India, where, of course, many of the mainstream faiths in India take reincarnation for granted. And there are many cases of children who speak of reincarnation there. And, and what I discovered was that, the easy explanation, the people who denigrated his work, the scientists who didn't take it seriously, they would say, well, reincarnation is a priori a foolish idea, because we know that, the personality is created by the brain, and when death, the brain disintegrates. So end of story. There's no way for that to pass on to, very materialistic view. And so therefore, any evidence that he collected was rejected before was even examined, just because they were going from the a priori thing that reincarnation can exist. Therefore, any evidence for it must be trumped up or false to begin with. And, that's a very unscientific way to look at the world, because a real scientist should say, hey, I'm open to look at any phenomenon and to examine it, without prejudging it. I know we have lots of theories about how the world works, but ultimately the world will show us how it works. And that's what doing science is all about, is trying to get the world to show us what it's made of and how it's made. So I went and when I first went with him, I thought, well, it's possible that he'll turn out to be some crackpot, or that these kids will be obviously lying, or their parents will be obviously putting them up to it, or everybody will so badly want to believe that they've come back from the dead, or that a loved one has, that they'll misremember things and add on to accounts. Well, it quickly became clear to me as we were interviewing these people and meeting them that none of that was true. These kids weren't crazy. The parents weren't crazy. They didn't care whether we believed them or not. They weren't trying to perpetrate a scam on us. And in many cases, they didn't want it to be true. It was sort of like they were having to admit that these kids were coming up with this incredible information in some way that they couldn't explain. Here's an example. Let me just give you, well, first of all, let me stop and see if you want to ask me anything at this point before I go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, being a teacher for over 30 years in indigenous ancient practices within Taoism, hey, I'm completely familiar with this. This is not something that would blow my mind in the sense of what your realization is. It's very real for a Taoist seeker. Yet, it becomes a more realized fact for someone who wants to use a new age language like science to identify with what it is that they're having, which is this present moment, which would be considered consciousness, spiritual consciousness, something greater. And I mean, hypnosis is also a great entry level to realize that you can access now through this merging of the conscious and unconscious processes. So I find it profound that you've come to that realization through your own journey, and you've documented something that can be verifiable and validated by the reader, the person who's listening to your very exploration of it. It's exciting. It's really profound stuff. Incarnation, reincarnation is something that people get very, sort of squeamish about, and it conflicts with their understanding of this materialism that they call their flesh and blood, their reality, as they sit before them. So when you start speaking in what you would call new age spiritual sort of terms, people start going, I don't know. You've lost me, but it's also part of what someone could possibly reference as a psyop of mind control on a much bigger level that creates people to be separated from their present moment, be separated from the idea that they are now, and that the idea of believing in past lives is just nonsensical. And so that's part of the programming, which is how powerful something like an entry level hypnosis becomes. It's like that's where you should always get a taste of what it means when you can get in there and change things at will, and they can be self-evident if you choose them to be. But generally speaking, that part of that premise behind hypnosis is telling someone, oh, don't worry, you have a choice. Well, free will is only free will when it's free will. Before that, it's just what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And quite frankly, from the words of someone who's a little bit more organic, Bruce Lipton, he would refer to it as, you're 5% conscious, 95% unconscious. That splitting hairs what that really means. But understand that free will is measured by what you are aware of, and then all this other stuff going on. And then, of course, you get these incredible documented realizations like the one you have, where this is real. And it's a symbiotic sort of visceral experience that validates it.
Well, I think it's interesting that we're coming from two different points of view in terms of how you know what reality is. And I would say what reality is through experiment and through reproducible evidence in that where you can look at a phenomenon and measure it and that anybody could come and repeat the experiment and get the same result. Where I think, from what I understand, what you're saying is you're coming from saying, well, that's fine for the material world, but that there's some other way to know what ultimate reality is other than, empirical evidence. And am I right in thinking that?
Well, kind of. I mean, the definition of Taoist seeking is self-evident. It's knowing, and that comes from a repeatable experience. I'm not a fluff and I'm a skeptical humanistic expression of that, my life experience. So when I bring in esoteric practices that are thousands of years old, they have to be repeatable. It's none of this nonsense talking about airy fairies coming in and floating on a lotus with 3 incense and I'm calling in kumbaya. That's all good and well, and it can be all represented in your own journey. But I want to show you something that you can repeat in what someone would perceive from a quantum model perspective, a 3D reality that you can identify with, whether it's a synchronicity, a serendipity moment of realization, a manifestation, magic healing, but it has to be realized. So then you get into these quantum packets of information that can validate that through a scientific model, going, well, when you do this, you get this response, whether it's precognition or other things of that nature that are more measurable within a science model. Quantum physics is another theory, but you have to be able to experience it. You're the validator, and it means nothing. It's like you had a sense. You're like, hang on a second, this guy's suggesting. Hypnosis in of itself is not a suggestible thing. You want to have a knowing to do that. It's like you're already entering into this with a skeptical mindset, and you're like, well, I probably just made this stuff up. I got an imagination. It happens. Well, that's a basic seed of where things start. But in essence, when we talk about things from a Taoist perspective, you're talking about between the breath in and the breath out. We refer to the bellows, which everything is contracting and expanding at the same time. You're all things are nothing at the same time. And that's where you find that center point, which some quantum physicists would call the 0 point. We call it the Wu Ji, where you can access the stillness, the mother. So it goes beyond the electromagnetic spectrum that people are familiar with that transmutes into a dualistic perspective.
That's the science.
Pardon me?
And that's what's accessible to science.
Sure. And that's why I like to measure it in all different forms.
Well, interestingly, so let me just sort of describe the dilemma that confronted me.
Yeah.
Is that, so I saw a lot of these cases where children sort of came up with amazing thing about specific people that they couldn't have known that turned out to be true. I'll just give you one example. There was a little girl in Lebanon who, from the time she could talk, she insisted that she had a husband, that she had 7 children, and that she missed them terribly. She would grab the phone off the hook and cry, before she could even dial a phone, and cry into it, Layla, Layla. And she was saying Layla was one of her daughters. And so she gave enough information so that and she wasn't talking about a life in a distant past. She was talking about an immediate previous generation. And it turns out that the names she was giving and the towns she was saying that she lived in, was probably about 50 kilometers away from where she was living then. And it turns out that the woman she was obviously referring to was a mother of 7 children, a wife and a mother of 7 children, who had actually traveled to Virginia in the United States for heart surgery and not survived the heart surgery. And so this family of the dead woman learned that this little girl was making these claims, saying that she had been their mother. And so the 2 daughters two daughters lived at home still, and they were grown women at the time. They were in their 20s. And they made an unannounced visit to this little girl's family. And they said that as soon as she walked in the door, as soon as they walked in the door, she called them by name. And the first thing she said to them was, "Finally, you've come." And then she said, "Did your uncles give you the jewelry as I asked them to?" Which completely floored them, because only the family knew that in the hospital before the surgery that killed her, she'd asked her brothers, told her brothers what jewelry of hers she wanted each daughter to have. And so they were convinced, even though they were skeptical, and even though it was actually the family thought that originally that maybe this was a scam because they were wealthy, maybe it was a scam to like get some of their money or something. And also the men in the family did business in Saudi Arabia, where the belief in reincarnation was really looked down on. So they were embarrassed by this whole connection. So they didn't want to believe it, and they went skeptically to uncover it and to prove it was false. And then this floored them. So we talked to them years later, and they said, this caused our family all sorts of problems, but we have to admit that this little girl knew stuff that only our mother could have known. So that's just one of cases. There are thousands of these cases. And the interesting thing about them is they all present exactly the same way almost, regardless of the culture. Mm-hmm. You'd think, some people said, well, they believe in reincarnation, so they're creating this to support their religious beliefs. But the Druze have this belief that you're born immediately after the death of the person whose personality you're taking. But in the Druze cases, a lot of them were remembering lives of people who died 5-10 years before they were born. So if they were creating these cases to support their religion, you'd think they'd do a better job of it. The same thing in India, where there's a belief in karma, where you're either punished or rewarded for the life you lived with the kind of rebirth that you had. Well, they had people who lived completely exemplary lives who ended up being reborn in the worst possible imaginable slum, in just terrible situation. So it didn't support the belief in their dogma about karma either. But a case in India among Hindus, and a case in Lebanon among the Druze, and for that matter, a case in America among white Christians, they're all exactly the same, where a child, as soon as they could communicate, begins to make claims that clearly reference previous lives, where they talk about them with great emotion. They miss people, they're uncomfortable in their new life or whatever, or they're tortured by memories of a previous life, bad memories of a previous life. So there's a real emotional connection, and it's the same regardless of what culture it occurs in, which suggests that it's a natural phenomenon. So anyway, to get to my dilemma was, after reviewing all this, I spent 18 months doing everything I could to research it, including these travels with Stevenson. And I became convinced that whatever these children were talking about was an authentic experience that they were having. I couldn't say that it was definitely reincarnation. And also, and some of the few scientists who seriously reviewed this, they say that in many cases that that it was very difficult to come up with a normal explanation for how these children had the information that they had. So that was where I was. It was almost like, okay, if it was just one case, maybe there's something that's escaping my attention, something that I'm missing here that could explain how it's not real. But there were not only dozens or hundreds, there were thousands of these cases. And all of them were, as I said, extremely similar. So here was this completely anomalous phenomenon of these children around the world coming up with these past life, what appeared to be past life memories. And on the other hand, as science advanced, and it's been 25 years since Old Souls was published. And in fact, in the beginning of next month, in just a week, there's a new edition, a 25th anniversary edition of Old Souls that's coming out that I wrote a new afterword for. And the afterword was basically me grappling with this after a quarter century after having written it. And people always ask me, well, what did you believe? What do you personally believe? And I've never been able to answer that question easily. So I sort of made myself answer it, and it took like 6,000 words in this afterword. And essentially it came down to, I didn't disbelieve these children, but on the other hand, in the past 25 years, science has gotten more and more evidence that all the things we think of as personality, our memories, our behaviors, our attitudes and feelings, all can be traced to specific processes in the brain. For instance, there were these researchers taught a mouse to walk a maze successfully by shocking them when they made the wrong turns. And then they traced the memory of the shock to specific sets of molecules in their brain, and to the point where they were able to dissect the mice, take that memory, the physical memory in the brain, implant it in the brain of another mouse, and then they put that mouse in the maze. They ran it just as if they had the experience of being shocked. So now here you have direct evidence that a experience that you've had is actually a string of physical molecules, that it's almost like a little tape that was created and inserted in the brain. And you could take that and insert it in another brain, and it would have the same impact as if it were experienced directly. And there's been lots of research, and then there's all sorts of, for instance, you can look at a brain scan now, an fMRI of somebody's brain, and you can give them a list of items to think about, and you can see in the brain, and you can tell if they're thinking about a cat or an airplane just by what's going on in the brain. So all of that would suggest that everything we think of as a personality that could be transferred during reincarnation is actually something physical in the brain, or a physical process in the brain. So therefore, if the brain is destroyed, there's no explanation of how that could be transferred to another person. And nobody has come up with any kind of, and all the possibilities for some kind of, energy that somehow transferred. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. So I had the conundrum of trying to come to grips with this almost irresolvable conflict between what is going on with these kids. And by the same token, in 25 years, nobody has come up with a better explanation for what's going on with these kids remembering these things, and these accurate memories of people that they've never met and couldn't possibly have known. So it's just like this conflict that I really had trouble with. And then I got an email from somebody, a few months ago, really. And this is what sort of prompted me to write this afterward. And he said, I remember, I'm from Lebanon, and I've moved to the United States. And when I was a child, I remembered the life of a man who was eating a pleasant lunch on his terrace, and suddenly he heard a big ruckus next door, in a playground next door. And he saw that his two kids were being beaten up by bigger kids, and in really, really sort of way that might be injuring them. So he quickly put down the pickle he was eating and rushed to save his kids. And as he led them away, he pushed the bigger boys off them, took his kids' hands, and he was walking away. And he said, and these two men in black robes attacked him and started stabbing him. And that the last thing he remembers is that they threw him in a pricker bush, and he could feel the thorns tearing his back, and then he was dead. And he said that when he told his family that he had this memory, there was an incident just like that had happened, and he met the family, and they confirmed all the details. They said down to that he was eating a pickle, and he put it down on the table when this happened. So he said, "So I want to know what you believe," and I gave him, a version of what I just told you about, with science, all saying, "Hey, sorry, but all experience is physical in the brain. They're getting more and more evidence to show that, and the brain is destroyed when you die, so reincarnation couldn't possibly be true." And he says, "Well, but the thing is, I know it's true because I lived it." And that made me realize something. And here's a interesting little tidbit. I noticed that one of the programs just before this one, you did with a woman who is studying synchronicity. Do you remember that interview? I think that was fairly recently, right? And they even have created this thing where they're studying the meaningful coincidences. Well, I had several experiences in my life of coincidences that were A, so unlikely, and B, so meaningful, that I realized that I couldn't put it down. I couldn't do what is the normal rational thing and say, "Hey, however unlikely it was just a coincidence." It was so specific and came at such a heightened moment of my emotional state, and that they happened like 10 years apart in similar situations, and they were so specific and so similar that I couldn't believe that they were meaningless, no matter what. And and anybody who was investigating that as a coincidence would say, "Well, how do we know that you're not embellishing it? And how do we know that you weren't hallucinating? And how do we know this and that?" And they couldn't possibly know, but I know. And that's what the guy who said, "Well, I know it's true because I experienced it." And like you said, it's something that you experience, and it has this, and you just know. I know that the circumstance was, I know that I don't go around saying, "Show me a sign," every 5 seconds. In fact, I know that these were the only 2 times in my life where I said, "I'm going to wait for a sign." And then within a minute, this unbelievable thing happened that I just couldn't believe. So I thought, okay, if I can't accept that this was just a meaningless coincidence, it wasn't a supernatural phenomenon of any kind, then how can I discount this guy's experience? All these children, the only explanation is, well, we're missing something. There's something off about it that we're not seeing. It looks convincing, but it can't be convincing because the science says otherwise. So what I'm left with is thinking, well, there must be some other explanation. Maybe like life is all but a dream. Life is a dream, and we make our own reality somehow. Or maybe it's being programmed. We're all a simulation. And there's some programs out there, and if they want to drop in a meaningful coincidence just to mess with your mind, it's child's play to them. They type out a bit of code, and you're having this amazing experience. So, so I still have to wrestle with this sort of bifurcated sense of reality that I have. On the one hand, it's like, show me some empirical evidence for this. On the other hand, it's like, hey, I had this experience, and I'd be crazy to think that these 2 1 in a billion chances happened purely by chance, and it had nothing to do with the meaningful aspects of my life that it obviously seemed to relate to. So I'm interested in what you think about all that.
Well, I mean, within Taoism, being ancient practices that I've been teaching people for decades, it goes simply like this. If you're thinking, you're not knowing. If you're knowing, you're feeling. So the visceral experience of that knowing is all you need. And, new age language like science, which is just short of a couple of 100 years old, is a great new way to perceive reality, yet it sort of falls in the path of what we call an absolute truth, which from a Taoist perspective, there is none. There's a million ways up the mountain. So you have to then go, okay, because you're experiencing what we call the bellows, which is everything is contracting, expanding at the same. You're all things and nothing at the same time, and man is not like that. And so we reference that by getting someone to understand that if you truly are not of this physical body and you believe in consciousness or something greater, then things are realized. So the serendipity, this synchronicities that are creating conflict for you is you're going from the science side that validates your understanding or knowing of reality, and then you go to this intuitive side where I can't deny what I'm experiencing to be true because I experienced it. No one else experienced it. I experienced it, and I know it's valid because I experienced it. So it's sort of that contracting and expanding, and then we call it the Wu Ji, which is the center point of all that, which is where you find the stillness, which is what we call the mother of all things, the Tao, which could be referred to as universal energy, Tao, Buddha, God, something greater that makes it possible for you to have this present moment. And the present moment is all you have. There is no past, no future.
And if someone said to you, well, how can you prove that that's true? Would you just say, well, proof isn't the point?
No, absolutely. I would show them in a physical manifestation, a physical healing, show them something that is undeniable, a miracle. Something goes.
Can you give me an example of that?
Over 30 years, I've witnessed so many miracles. I can't. Let me give you an example. Human flesh transmuting from black, gangrenous black to pink in color in 40 minutes, bones fusing in front of me, tumors disappearing, people walking that haven't walked for 30 years, people that have cancer that goes away in a breath. I mean, it just goes on.
Process by which this happens.
This is all part of being the present moment, which is a processes through the alchemy, and it's what you would define within an electromagnetic spectrum as resonance. And you resonate.
And if a scientist came to you and said, okay, I want to witness this happening so we can measure it and document it, how would that work?
Well, I mean, it would have to be a variable of different things that take place, but sure. I mean, it's for me, the validation and what happens is that I notice is the individual. I'll remind you of this. I observe these things. So the present moment is how they're obtained. And so from a quantum model, if you believe in quantum physics or Newtonian physics or however you perceive your reality, a quantum model is the now. It's the 0 point from a unified field theory. You go back to, what Einstein would call the spooky stuff. However you want to define it, it's, a Planck model or Planck unit of energy, which comes back to this symbiotic, all is one, one is all, that everything is taking place immediately. It's oscillating, it's expanding and contracting all at the same time. This is how we define distant healing from a Taoist perspective, which people would call impossible, where I could talk to someone on the other side of the world and they've got a back pain and wiggle my finger and poof, the back pain's gone. It's happening now. Now, that's why the energetic potential is so important from a dualistic perspective within a Taoist seeker, is to cultivate those energies so that it's present. From someone who's skeptic, is to witness something that would not be possible from a physicality perspective, which would be the lowest form of transmutated energy expression in this realm. But let's just say, whether you have a back pain, disappears, a headache, whatever, a tumor, these things are all potential of change. That's that present moment. And the possibilities are endless. I've just seen so many I can't even, I have people come to me, they're like, oh, grandma, you're that guy I need to call. Grandma's in a coma, she's going to die. And all I do is tap into the information and say, no. And this would be reference to the next day they wake up out of a coma and, hey, oh my goodness, grandma was supposed to die and the doctors are telling me that she's completely conscious and comes out of a coma. Now, what makes that possible? And now I come to a dear friend of mine, Tom Campbell, who's an ex-NASA physicist and an OBE-er and a scientist by nature. He had to learn how to become intellectually realized, and through that he became a scientist. But his intuitive nature basically led him through his whole journey, and even at the ripe old young age of 80, teaches people out-of-body experience. Part of the stuff I teach people is astral projection, all that kind of stuff. But he's experienced exactly the same thing. Now, when you go show me, it's the present moment. I see so many of these miracles that it's like you can measure it. If you want to define it, I witness physical flesh wiggle back and forth in front of you, transmute. So if it's a cut, if it's a wound, whatever, I've seen it just transmute.
If I was with you, would I also see the physical flesh wiggle back?
Well, it's undeniable. It's altering a 3D reality. You're bringing.
But I mean, have you ever had an outsider come in?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you don't have to have a belief system. This is the thing. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to be. It's now. And so for me to even obtain that level of consciousness and you go, that's a miracle, I have to be the present moment. And this comes down to the energetic potential that's so important and so ingrained into the Taoist alchemy practices, is when you access that present moment, what we call the Wu Ji, the center point, the stillness, that is when things get altered. It doesn't happen any other way.
How old are you now?
52.
So what do you make of the idea that you will inevitably get sick and die at some point?
That's a belief system. That's
part of
the Taoist model is in like immortality.
So what do you think will happen to you in 30 or 40 years from now?
Well, in my situation, if I do a timeline, it's about my natural born life is about 156 years. I give people past life readings all the time, but let's just say whatever happens, I've had the privilege of transitioning dozens of people in my lifetime from this physical flesh to the next incarnation, reincarnation, what you want to put it. It's a profound mystical experience that can be defined when you develop what we call sensory perception within Taoist alchemy. You're able to see these things that most people would say within a scientific model is the 99% of the light spectrum that is not potential for the human eye. You are able to witness. This is where, I have discussions with neuroscientists and physicists and psychologists, because guess what? Once you access the potential of the 50 trillion cells of 0.07 millivolts, these are ancient alchemical processes that we can talk about from the periodic table, and you embody those within the energetic potential, which has been identified within Hindu practices for thousands of years. Within Taoism, we call them dantians, they're energy centers, and you're able to merge and separate the electromagnetic spectrum of this 3D reality, but it's not real until you see it. I don't care what anyone says. Oh, I witnessed this, and I'm like, I believe you, but until I see it, it doesn't mean anything to me. That's not my truth. My truth is experience. The experiencer is the now. And that's where the most important thing, like that charge you got up your spine right now, is that realization. And then people go, well, hang on a second. How can you even say that? How do you know that? Because I can see it. I can see the charge you got again. It's like I can see it with my eyes because it's a clear sense. And then I feel it if I choose to. So I get a visceral experience if I choose to, because now we're mending into different energetic symbiotic experiences. You are me, I am you. So sampling your energetic potential is there, but from a clear sense perspective, there's a lot of resistance for you because of the energetic channel, which for most energetic sensitivity comes from the lung channel.
So in the Taoist point of view, or
right.
Your point of view, do these stories of children who are remembering specific previous lives, does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I when I meet someone, if they're on this journey, I give them their last 9 lives. And so they'll lay down and they can keep their eyes open or closed. And when I reveal each life leading up to this one, they have a visceral experience. Now, normally speaking, the emission from the usual seeker is their eyes are closed. They see it in their third eye. It's a visceral thing. You need the potential of what that means, right? Does it not shock you when I say to you, hey, look, I can feel the energy you're feeling? Does that not mean anything? Or
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm having a conversation with you. That's the energy I'm feeling. I don't know.
right. Now the resistance of the energetic potential from your lung channel, which from a Chinese medicine perspective, people will refer to as the sadness, the grief, the helplessness, the hopelessness, that blocks what is potential, what is the truth to your energetic potential. Now, that has everything to do with your own journey and how you express it energetically. But when you are able to access that, all of a sudden, all the things that you are experiencing will become heightened to a whole nother level from an energetic perspective. And clearly, there's something urging you to continue to seek this out because of the conflict. The truth is, you want to know, you want to continue to know, you want to keep looking, because if you didn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Well, I also wrote a book about psychedelics, and I've had some very interesting experience with psychedelics and with psilocybin and LSD and things like that, and where I have seen the world in a very different way. So it's
Yeah.
I mean I'm hearing what you're saying for sure. I'm not definitely not just saying that you're full of shit because I think I like I said you can't say that if you've had these experiences yourself and you think, hey, I know they're real.
Right. And I mean, that's that potential, right? It's like doing stupid things like sometimes evoking someone's consciousness is just leveling up some level of awareness. So, I would do silly, circus tricks like envelop my forearm with anesthesia from a state of consciousness, drive a skewer through it, pull it out, and you won't see an entry or exit point. These are fundamental Qigong practices.
You've done that?
Yeah. And so, these are that chill you got right now is like, oh, I resonate with that.
Could you do that on demand? I mean, could you do it right now?
Or if I want, I mean, if that was something that potential is always the initial allure to what is possible. That kind of so the amount of things that I've witnessed or seen or participate in never seems to end. And sure, if that's the wonderment of the excitement of how you level up in your consciousness, then let it be that way, and it will be. And if I'm in the mood to share that with a seeker, I will show you. But that will be determined by the present moment. And most of the time, I'm always up to the excitement of having someone's mind blown, because that's just part of it. I mean, that's the only reason it's there. Now, does that equal conscious awareness? Potentially. That's there for that moment, right? There are no coincidences, in my opinion. That's how I live my life. Now, with that said, you have all these weird sort of situations where it doesn't matter. There's so many blockages within someone's experience. They'll see a healing. I've given people a witness to healing on somebody, having a conversation with them for 10 seconds, and all of a sudden their healing has taken place, and they've spent 6 months attempting to re-exacerbate the actual event so that they could prove themselves wrong that they experienced it. So, for example, that particular one person had an injury, and their injury was gone within a few seconds of having a conversation with me without their knowledge. And then they spent 6 months attempting to destroy that and make that injury potential again, because they could not wrap their mind around how that was possible. It just doesn't make sense to them. And, these things happen. And you also have to realize that contracting and expanding, as a Taoist would see it, is everything and nothing at the same time. And, you just see this happening all the, It's just an ongoing event. Like 30 years ago, when I had people coming to me with psychotic episodes, potentially committed to a psych ward, today would have the same event, wake up, tell the world they're channeling the Palladians, get a YouTube channel, and have 100,000 people following them. It's just a whole different ballgame now. I mean, and this is where people call the potential of consciousness, right? It's raising up there. And so spiritual consciousness, from a dear friend, James Toomey, his definition of what it is not separating yourself, right? You're having these incredible moments of realization, but you're still separating yourself through your wordsmithing, your intellect, even though your intuitive is overwhelming, because you wouldn't be pursuing any of this stuff if your intuitive side, your right brain intuitive instincts were not driving you to want to find more. So you're still looking, you're still seeking. It's part of the magical journey of realizing you're not of this body. It's like there's something going on. It's like,
well, that's fascinating, and I think that has to be the last word here.
Well, it's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today. One last question. What's your definition of consciousness?
My definition of consciousness. I think that I'm actually just reading a book about consciousness, and I don't think anybody has been able to define it successfully, as far as I know. But I guess, it's basically everything that I experience is my definition of consciousness.
I love it. I love it, my dear friend. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Right.
I want to thank the universe for bringing you into my life. I want to thank the audience for sharing their time with us today. I am your humble servant and Sifu, Taoist Master San Qing, and I'll see you on the next one, guys.
All right, bye.